The myth recounting the story of Atalanta and her foot race against her suitor Hippomenes has provided the ancients with a nearly inexhaustible storehouse of symbols and occult meanings. Particularly instructive of the hidden, dynamical metamorphoses of nature herself. One of the most famous alchemical texts was created by Michael Meyer in 1617 in the town of Oppenheim, situated in the Upper Rhine. It is called Atalanta Fugaens, or Atalanta Fleeing, Fugain being translated from the Greek as either meaning flee or avoid. Either translation, as we will come to discover, is appropriate for this tale, and its function in highlighting the royal art. The work itself contains 50 illustrations with deep symbolic significance. It is beyond a doubt that Meyer had read and was deeply influenced by the works of the exiled Roman poet Ovid and his 15 books comprising the Metamorphoses, which recount countless instances of the transformation of gods, humans, and animals into varying combinations, mimicking ultimately the creative energy of the natural and supernatural worlds. Working off of Ovid's version of the story, Meyer converted it into an alchemical allegory and found that it was so profoundly illustrative of the royal art as a whole that he made it his frontispiece to the entire work. In the second part of this two-part series on the myth of Atalanta, I wish to explore some common interpretations of this myth by ancient alchemists, poets, and philosophers, but I also want to provide my own unique observations that I have not seen in the literature, that may give us perhaps key insights into the working of nature herself and the alchemical art. But first, let us briefly ask ourselves, why must alchemical inquiries into the nature of physis inevitably involve the interpretation and analysis of myth? What can myth teach us? Without delving too deeply into a video into the structure of myth itself, taking us of course too far afield, we can say that myth is tightly bound with interpretation. It is too restrictive to suggest that an interpretation is either correct or incorrect, since an interpretation, using language, structures the world around it, and allows aspects of reality to present itself in new dynamic relations and organizations of power. In this sense, interpretation, and hence myth, are functional and embodied, and not simple abstractions of concepts that, quote, represent something else in the, quote, real world. Myth can be used as a method of investigation, and the means by which myth is expressed is of course through language, but more specifically a quality of language that can best be understood as poetry. Language mediates the experience of the natural world with the world of thought and mind. But unlike purely scientific classifications and taxonomies, or even the mundane language of the everyday, poetry becomes a kind of speech that borders between spoken language and song. In this sense, poetry, unlike logic or mathematics, is the most accommodating form of expression that mediates between the multiform and protean nature of the mind, with the equally multiform and protean metamorphoses of nature. Myth and poetry are siblings. As is recounted from Plato's Ion, poetai hermeneias ton theo. The poets are the interpreters of the gods. It is this transfer of inspiration and revelation from the gods along a chain of being to the final expression through the human mouth that such myths are born and revealed. In a similar way, the Greek word prophetes literally translates to declarer, but in a more nuanced way it means, quote, to speak on behalf of the sacred or the divine. For in the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, Gregory Nagy relates how, quote, the prophetes declares, formalizes as a speech act the words of the inspired mantis. Or, as Martilli translates the word prophetes, quote, as a revealer of every truth in immediate contact with its gods. In this respect, we can see that the mantic oracle discovered the content of the divine message, while the prophetes developed its form, which was then to be articulated through poetic speech. Let us take a relatively modern example of the link between prophecy and poetry. Like Meyer and many deep and soulful figures before him, the 20th century poet T.S. Eliot was similarly influenced by the works of the Roman poet of Eros and exile, Publius Ovidius Naso, or better known simply as Ovid. Of particular interest to T.S. Eliot was the blind seer Tiresias, whom Eliot called, quote, the most important personage in the poem. T.S. Eliot was educated in the classics, so he would have had ample opportunity to being introduced to this figure. However, the Metamorphoses does contain a particular story of Tiresias that T.S. Eliot adopts. This interest of Eliot's in the figure of Tiresias is illustrated by the fact that his poem, The Wasteland, comprising of a total of 434 verses, introduces the prophet at almost exactly the middle of the poem, verse 215. There are many differing stories that relate how Tiresias lost his eyesight and gained the insight of prophecy. Ovid recounts the story of how Zeus and Hera were arguing about who derives more pleasure from sexual intercourse, men or women. Hera argued it was men who had more pleasure from the act, and so they decided to settle the dispute by asking Tiresias, who, because he had upset Hera in an earlier situation, had been transformed by her into a woman for 7 years. Having experienced life in both sexes, he was obviously the most authoritative source. He confirmed that women indeed derive more pleasure from sex, and was punished by Hera and blinded. Zeus, in recompense, granted him long life and the gift of prophecy. In the section of The Wasteland entitled The Fire Sermon, Tiresias' bisexuality is hinted at while he observes a lowly clerk in modern-day London visiting a tired and bored female typist. Let us read it together out loud. At the violet hour, when the eyes and back turn upward from the desk, when the human engine waits, like a taxi throbbing waiting, I, Tiresias, though blind throbbing between two lives, old man with wrinkled female breasts, can see at the violet hour the evening hour that strives homeward, and brings the sailor home from sea. The typist home at tea time clears her breakfast, lights her stove, and lays out food in tins. Out of the window perilously spread her drying combinations touched by the sun's last rays. On the divan are piled, at night, her bed, stockings, slippers, camisoles, and stays. I, Tiresias, old man with wrinkled dugs, perceived the scene, and foretold the rest. I, too, awaited the expected guest. He, the young man carbuncular, arrives, a small house agent's clerk with one bold stare. One of the low on whom assurance sits has a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. The time is now propitious, as he guesses. The meal is ended, she is bored and tired, endeavors to engage her in caresses, which still are unreproved if undesired. Flushed and decided, he assaults at once. Exploring hands encounter no defense. His vanity requires no response, and makes a welcome of indifference. And I, Tiresias, have forsuffered all, enacted on this same divan or bed. I, who have sat by Thebes below the wall, and walked among the lowest of the dead, bestows one final patronizing kiss, and gropes his way, finding the stairs unlit. She turns and looks a moment in the glass, hardly aware of her departed lover. Her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass. Well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over. When lovely woman stoops to folly, and paces about her room again, alone, she smooths her hair with automatic hand, and puts a record on the gramophone. After their hasty meal, the clerk seeks to satisfy his sexual urges, and in a brief spasm almost before it has begun, it is over. The typist, quote, looks a moment in the glass, hardly aware of her departed lover. Well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over, she says. Here we can see a reversal of the judgment of Tiresias. In this scenario, it is the female who derives no pleasure from the advances of the male. Tiresias has lived both lives, and so can relate to both figures intimately. It is important to realize that the figure of Tiresias is the bond that unites the opposites of male and female in the entire poem. Furthermore, it is through his consciousness that the fragmentation of images that is T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland can become unified into a whole or a unity. He is also that bridge connecting the ancient past of antiquity with the modern 20th century London. In this sense, Tiresias and Eliot, as representatives of a bi-unity, connect prophecy and poetry, respectively, and highlight their interrelations. To heal the fragmentation and fracturing that constitutes modernity, we have need of the blind prophet who binds and redeems the world through their inspired poetic speech. Returning to discussions of the past, eventually the mantic and prophetic roles were collapsed into one another, finally resulting in the alchemists utilizing the term, for the alchemists were also considered prophets. In section 15 of Pseudo-Democritus, on the making of purple and gold, natural and secret questions, the author addresses his fellow alchemists in exactly this term. O you who are prophets with me, ho sim prophetai. I know that you are not incredulous, but rather open to wonder. Thaumasantas. You know in fact the power of the matter. I want to briefly bring to your attention the word that is used, and that is the word wonder. Wonders, or thaumata, as a description of the delights and awe that the alchemist will experience in the course of his experimental investigations and interactions with nature. These wonders very much mirror the sentiments and empirical observations expressed by Empedocles in fragment B96 when he describes the formation and emergence of bone. Quote, and these parts came to be white bones, having been fitted together out of a divine marvel, thespesathin, through the cohesive bonds of harmonia. To come to our earlier point regarding the intimacy between mythology and its expression of nature's hidden and revealed processes, we can see Empedocles as the embodiment of the true prophetes, the empirical scientist or physiologist who weaves an intricate tapestry of biology, cosmology, physiology, mythology, and poetry. It is indeed clear that he arises from a long tradition of orphics, whose founder was the poet who could enchant nature by the strumming of his lyre and singing of his poetic voice. Language expressed in purely scientific terms lacks vital power, and biological processes, reduced to intellectual abstractions, is barren. The reason this is so is because in both of these scenarios, the self or the soul is absent. It is the orphic poet who unites and revivifies both of these modes of inquiry, and it is through the articulation of myth as a speech act that recreates the cosmos anew. Seeing myth as a mode of investigation into nature opens us up onto worlds of images and feeling tones that orient and frame our experience on an imaginal plane that the mundane use of the senses could never provide the key to. We live in a world of dynamism and flux, contained within the hypostasis of life, along with the rest of nature, because we are nature. And yet, as observers of nature, we are also simultaneously something more. In a profound work on orphic poetry, Elizabeth Sewell recounts the early modern philosopher Francis Bacon, who contributed much to various fields of knowledge, including science. What is unique about Bacon is that he was ambiguously both an orphic poet and what Sewell calls a technologist. Influenced by the works of Pico della Mirandola, he realized that myth, theology, and natural philosophy all jointly operated to discover the secrets of nature, and that nature operated by certain laws of motion that manifested a continual process. This constant motion and change, however, was both manifest and observable, and hidden and occulted. Quote, for what I understand by it is not certain measures or signs or successive steps of process in bodies which can be seen, but a process perfectly continuous, which for the most part escapes the sense. The radical contribution to thought provided by Bacon was to invert the logical progression of Aristotelianism, which insisted on beginning any inquiry into nature on its first principles, or arche, downward into the particulars. As Edward Butler observes, quote, "For Francis Bacon, matter is active, and the pre-Socratic natural philosophers to a degree recovered by him." This is particularly evident in his work entitled The Wisdom of the Ancients. Bacon reversed this process by introducing the tool of induction. He allowed reasoning to begin with observation of different particulars, which would then slowly move up from there to abstracted general principles. However, Butler reminds us that Bacon is not simply relying solely on observation of data, since his, quote, "inductive science both operates upon more eclectic materials, not merely observations, but also pre-existing theoretical speculations and concepts over every grade, and also according to a method more attuned to the object and to the effort to help it emerge in all its natural subtlety." This is a direct move away from the ossification of abstraction to see the world in all its dynamic energy. As you can expect, his writings and philosophies contributed greatly to the emergence and continuance of the scientific revolution which had begun in his lifetime. Because of this influence, later historians had seen a one-sided figure in Bacon, as the father of industrial science and the scientific materialism it presupposed. But the orphic side of his nature was expressed in the fact that he was deeply interested in discovering the precise point where mind, language, and nature meet and interact. Like countless mystics and philosophers before him, Bacon was later joined by the likes of C.G. Jung, who in his investigations into alchemical literature and psychology sought to discover this same link between mind and matter. It would be fruitful to quote at length one of Jung's seminars on Nietzsche. "You see, when we speak of the unconscious, we mean the psychological unconscious, which is a possible concept. We are then dealing with certain factors in the unconscious which we really can understand and discriminate. But the part of the unconscious which is designated as the subtle body becomes more and more identical with the functioning of the body, and therefore it grows darker and darker and ends in the utter darkness of matter. That aspect of the unconscious is exceedingly incomprehensible. I only mentioned it because in dealing with Nietzsche's concept of the self, one has to include a body, so one must include not only the shadow, the psychological unconscious, but also the physiological unconscious, the so-called somatic unconscious, which is the subtle body. You see, somewhere our unconscious becomes material, because the body is the living unit, and our conscious and unconscious are embedded in it. They contact the body. Somewhere there is a place where the two ends meet and become interlocked, and that is a place where one cannot say whether it is matter or what one calls psyche. What C.G. Jung is referring to here when he mentions the, quote, "physiological unconscious" is of course in this context a subtle body, but in order to understand the problem posed by him, we need not jump to mystical notions of the ontological truth of a subtle body, but a more grounded and biological notion of the autonomic nervous system functions, which include involuntary processes like breathing, digesting, sexual arousal, blood pressure, and heart rate. We do not have continuous conscious control of our breathing, and this process itself, so vital to our everyday functioning and well-being, falls readily into unconsciousness for a good portion of our lives. There is a point at which the physiological and the psychological meet, and as Jung says, quote, "somewhere there is a place where the two ends meet and become interlocked, and that is the place where one cannot say whether it is matter or what one calls psyche." Sadly, this very intriguing question is hardly ever brought up in the vast material online and in books that popularizes and promotes the work of Jungian psychology in our contemporary landscape. Such inquiries can provide fruitful results if only we ceased reiterating superficial Jungian talking points and pursued the paths he had indicated further. So let us return to Francis Bacon. Sewell remarks that those who thought he was an extremely practical-minded man due to his obsession with mechanization and the mechanical arts do not understand his intention. For it is the artifice of man, or the art of alchemy for instance, that gives man the power to interrogate nature, to reveal her secrets. The term he often uses is inquisitio, and as a lawyer he would have been well aware of the deceptions and dissimulations that a client, never mind nature or matter, can employ to escape containment and inquiry. Admittedly, our philosophical approach to nature and alchemy is not aligned in this manner with Bacon. We do not seek to handcuff, imprison, or torture her to reveal her secrets. But the many processes of boiling, distilling, dissolving, etc. do put nature in a rather unpleasant position that accelerates her natural processes to induce a result. This does require a degree of manipulation by the operator for a particular outcome, whether with respect to combining of reactive substances or observing the temperature and timing of procedures. But it is important to be reminded that in our tradition, any operation begins and ends with the expression Deo concedente, God willing. We do not seek to work against the rhythms of nature, but to conform to it, and perhaps at times accelerate the process. But after all, what's the rush? If you believe in the transmigration of the soul and reincarnation, what is the particular hurry to complete the art in one human lifetime? Additionally, and this is a link perhaps assumed by many listeners of this channel, there is a distinct relation between alchemy and theurgy. Iamblichus himself believed that the processes governing the transmutation of matter were the same processes working simultaneously upon man, aided on by divine fire. Quote, all that is in us becomes like to God's, just as the fire assimilates all hard and solid objects to subtle and luminous bodies, and it carries us also by sacrifice in the fire of the altars to the divine fire. Jung echoes this notion of the interdependence between the operator and nature that is operated upon throughout his works, by insisting that a true chemical reaction cannot take place without both reagents being changed in some manner. We can equate these bindings of nature to the story relayed by Menelaus in the Iliad, when he laid hold of the old man of the sea, Proteus, to determine which of the gods Menelaus had offended. Like nature herself, Proteus engaged in a multitude of metamorphoses to escape his clutches, first as a lion, then a serpent, a leopard, then a pig, and then water, and then as a tree. Francis Bacon, of course, was familiar with this story, and in order to illustrate the need for art and artifice to speed along the processes of nature to disclose her secrets, we can lend our ears to his explanation of the myth of Atalanta. Quote, this fable seems to contain a noble allegory of the contest betwixt art and nature. For art, here denoted by Atalanta, is much swifter or more expeditious in its operations than nature, when all obstacles and impediments are removed and sooner arrives at its end. This appears almost in every instance. Thus, fruit comes slowly from the kernel, but soon by inoculation or incision. Clay, it left to itself, is a long time in acquiring a stony hardness, but is presently burnt by fire into brick. So again in human life, nature is a long while in alleviating and abolishing the remembrance of pain and assuaging the troubles of the mind. But moral philosophy, which is the art of living, performs it presently. Yet this prerogative and singular efficacy of art is stopped and retarded to the infinite detriment of human life by certain golden apples. For there is no one science or art that constantly holds on its true and proper course to the end, but they are all continually stopping short, forsaking the track, and turning aside to profit and convenience, exactly like Atalanta. Whence it is no wonder that art gets not the victory over nature, nor according to the condition of the contest brings her under subjection, but on the contrary remains subject to her as a wife to a husband. We believe we have sufficiently set the stage, and in the next video we will explore the myth of Atalanta in more detail and discuss some of the ways the alchemist can use it to learn about nature and the royal art. Take care for now.